In the late autumn of 1796, when Hollow's End was little more than a scattering of stone cottages clinging to the edge of the valley, the arrival of the Callahan family was a disruption that no one could ignore. The family's carriage, dark and lacquered to a mirror-like shine, rolled through the mud-soaked roads under a sky bruised with rain, drawn by two black horses whose eyes seemed too bright in the gloom. The father, Ewan Callahan, was a gaunt man with the look of a scholar who had spent too long indoors, his frame swallowed by a long coat that trailed behind him as he walked. His wife, Bridget, was pale and withdrawn, speaking to no one, and yet it was their 7 daughters who seized the attention of everyone in the village. Ranging in age from about 8 to 17, they stepped down from the carriage one by one, moving with a grace so deliberate that even the hard-bitten farmers fell silent to watch. Each girl had the same shade of raven-black hair, the same luminous grey eyes, and an uncanny likeness that made them seem more like copies of one another than siblings. Their arrival was shrouded in tragedy, for word had spread that the Callahan ancestral estate in the Scottish Highlands had been reduced to ash after a fire that claimed the lives of their extended kin. No one knew precisely what had caused the blaze, but the whispers that travelled south with them spoke of unnatural circumstances, of a night sky lit with a fire that did not behave like fire, of screams that carried far beyond the hills, of shadows moving against the blaze that should have been consumed but were not. Ewan had purchased the manor at Hollow's End, a sprawling estate with ivy-choked walls and shuttered windows that had stood empty for decades. The locals had always considered the house unlucky, muttering that no family who had lived there had ever stayed for more than a generation. And yet, the Callahans moved in swiftly and completely, closing the gates behind them and allowing no curious villager beyond the threshold. From the first winter, it became clear that the Callahans kept strange habits. Ewan was rarely seen outside the grounds, and when he was, he carried thick volumes under his arm, books with cracked leather spines and pages stained dark as if by smoke. He was rumoured to be a student of ancient texts, not the kind studied by clergymen, but the kind kept locked away, catalogues of forgotten rites and fragments of languages that predated the church. He would spend hours in the library of the manor, and at night villagers claimed to see the light of many candles flickering from behind the tall, arched windows. Bridget was seen even less often, and some said her health was failing, that she drifted through the halls of the manor like a shadow, silent and exhausted, leaving the care of the 7 daughters to each other. The sisters, though young, seemed to require little guidance, always appearing together in the gardens or along the tree line, whispering among themselves in tones no one else could hear. As months turned into years, Hollow's End watched the sisters grow into striking young women whose beauty made them the object of fascination and unease. Farmers on the road claimed to see them standing in the fields at twilight, hands clasped, their faces turned toward the last light of the sun as though in prayer. Others spoke of waking at night to hear a sound drifting on the wind, something that might have been singing but too low and too steady to be mistaken for anything joyful. By 1802, the villagers had begun to avoid the road that led past the manor after dark, uneasy with the feeling that the sisters' eyes were following them from the shadows. Even those who dismissed the talk of strangeness could not deny that a silence seemed to hang over the Callahan property, a stillness that was not quite natural, as though the very air hesitated before crossing the boundary of their land. When Ewan began buying oddities from travelling merchants, curiosity turned to suspicion. He requested jars of rare herbs, bones of animals not native to England, stones marked with foreign symbols, and once an entire wagon filled with candles. These items were carried into the manor under cover of night, and though no one ever saw them again, some swore they could smell the herbs burning on the wind for miles around, mingling with the damp scent of the forest. There were reports of lights that were not lanterns moving through the upper floors of the house, strange blue glows that flickered and vanished when approached. It was during this time that Hollow's End first heard the unsettling rumour that Bridget Callahan had not been seen for months and that perhaps she had passed quietly within the house. No funeral was ever held, and yet one spring morning, 7 black dresses could be seen swaying from the washing line behind the manor, drying in the misty sun as though untouched by human hands. By the time a full decade had passed since their arrival, the Callahans had become a family set apart, a subject of dread as much as of fascination. The sisters, who should by then have been approaching womanhood, seemed untouched by the years. They had the same pale skin, the same unlined faces, the same ageless grace that they had possessed the day they arrived. Those who had watched them closely from the beginning began to murmur that something was wrong, that their youth was too perfect, too enduring. When the church bell tolled on Sundays, the sisters did not come, and when harvest festivals filled the valley with music, they did not appear. Instead, the manor remained quiet, save for the occasional sound of chanting, rhythmic and low, carried on the night air from behind the tall stone walls. The seven sisters were unlike any children Hollow's End had ever known, and as the years turned to decades, their strange perfection began to take on an almost unbearable quality. Each sister was a mirror of the next, not merely in appearance, but in the way they moved, breathed, and seemed to occupy the same thought. They were said to walk the grounds of the manor barefoot, even in the frost, leaving no visible tracks in the snow behind them. Neighbors who dared to spy from the edges of the property spoke of watching the sisters gather in a perfect circle, their heads bowed, their hands joined, as though part of some ritual no one else was permitted to understand. There was no laughter from them, no shouts of childhood play, only the quiet unity of their movements, as though they were bound by something more profound than blood. By 1821, an artist commissioned to paint the family produced a portrait that would become the most haunting artifact of the Callahan story. The image, still preserved in the Hollow's End archives, depicts the sisters seated in a row, their hair spilling over identical black dresses, their faces arranged in an expression too serene to be called warm. The portrait shows no obvious difference in age between them, though at the time they should have ranged from their early 20s to near 30. Visitors who saw the portrait when it was first unveiled remarked that they could not look for long, for the eyes of the sisters seemed to follow them around the room. Even now, those who have studied the painting up close claim there is a detail impossible to ignore. Each sister's pupil is painted just a fraction too large, as though the artist, whether by design or accident, captured something predatory in their gaze. Despite the passage of time, the sisters' appearance remained unnervingly unchanged, and the people of Hollow's End began to speak of it in hushed tones, fearful of being overheard. A child born in 1800 could grow to manhood, marry, and have children of his own, and still the sisters looked exactly as they had the day he first saw them. The women of the village whispered that no good could come from such a thing, that it was unnatural for flesh to defy time. Men who admired the sisters' beauty from afar found themselves uneasy in their presence, for there was no warmth in their smiles, no softness in their voices, only the quiet stillness of something watching and waiting. The air around them seemed to grow heavy, as if even the birds stopped their song when the sisters walked through the orchards. Stranger still were the accounts of those who had reason to cross the Callahan land. Woodcutters and shepherds told of hearing the sisters' voices long before they saw them, a low murmur that rose and fell like the tide, speaking words in a tongue that no one could recognize. On more than one occasion, a traveler who had been passing through Hollow's End reported glimpsing the seven figures at the upper windows of the manor, all lined up in silence, staring out as though keeping watch over the valley. These reports became so frequent that the manor came to be known as the House of the Seven Watchers, and a superstition grew among the villagers that if you locked eyes with one of the sisters too long, something would follow you home. The passing years brought with them no weddings, no births, no deaths to mark the turning of time in the Callahan family. The sisters seemed content to remain together in that dark house, their lives a closed circle into which no outsider could step. There were those who tried, young men who brought flowers to the gates or called out from the road, only to be met with silence or the fleeting glimpse of a pale face retreating into the shadows. The rejection only deepened the fascination until the sisters became something of an obsession for certain men who would linger outside the gates after nightfall. Several of these men were later found wandering the woods, days later, with no memory of what had happened to them, their mouths filled with dirt as though they had been lying face down in the earth. By the 1830s, Hollow's End had begun to turn against the Callahans in earnest. The sight of the sisters had shifted from a source of wonder to one of dread, and whispers of witchcraft began to spread. The villagers spoke of livestock being born deformed, of milk spoiling overnight, of children waking from nightmares claiming to have seen seven pale women standing at the foot of their beds. It was said that the sisters appeared younger with every year that passed, as though instead of merely halting age they had found a way to turn it backward, growing more luminous, more unearthly, more removed from the ordinary world that surrounded them. By the year 1843, the unease surrounding the Callahan sisters had turned into something far darker, a collective dread that settled over Hollow's End like a shroud. The village had endured nearly half a century of watching them move through the world untouched by time, their faces unchanged, their bodies unbowed by age, while the generations around them grew old, withered, and were buried. The sight of the sisters, walking together in perfect step along the edge of the fields, began to inspire not admiration, but terror, for it seemed to mock the natural order. Mothers clutched their children closer when the sisters passed, and those who once spoke kindly of their beauty now turned their faces away, muttering prayers under their breath. The turning point came when a spate of deaths struck Hollow's End over a single winter, claiming livestock first, then children, then two of the strongest men in the village, all without clear cause, as if the very breath of life had been stolen from them. It was the parish priest, Father Halewood, who first gave voice to what everyone had begun to fear in silence. He declared that the sisters were not merely odd but dangerous, that their refusal to age was evidence of a pact with darkness. His sermons grew more urgent with each passing Sunday, warning that the valley was under a curse, that the Callahan sisters had bartered their souls for eternal youth, and that it was the duty of the faithful to drive such evil from their midst. It was not long before others took up the cry, and talk of witchcraft spread like a fever, whispered in the tavern, murmured at the market, and carried from door to door until it seemed the entire village spoke of nothing else. The manor gates were found defaced with crude crosses drawn in white chalk, and once a dead crow was left on the stone steps, its wings pinned out with nails. The sisters did not respond to any of this, and their silence only made matters worse. Their appearances outside the manor grew rarer, but when they were seen, they were always together, moving as one, their faces betraying no fear, no anger, no trace of humanity that might have softened the growing hatred. On a moonless night in late autumn, a group of villagers gathered outside the manor with torches and demanded that the sisters come out and face them. No answer came, but those in the crowd swore they heard faint singing from deep within the house, a sound so pure and so chilling that several fled in panic. When dawn came, the torches were found extinguished, laid carefully in a row by the gate, as though someone had passed among them in the night and placed them there by hand. Tension reached its peak when Father Halewood summoned priests from neighboring parishes to perform an exorcism upon the Callahan estate. 3 men arrived in Hollow's End, each bearing holy water, relics and crosses, and together they marched up to the manor gates. Witnesses said the air grew heavy as they approached, the wind dying to a strange, suffocating stillness. The priests were inside the gates for less than an hour before they emerged again, pale-faced and trembling, refusing to speak of what they had seen. One of them, a man named Father Dunn, left the village that very night and never returned, while another was said to have fallen ill and died within the year, raving on his deathbed about voices calling to him from the dark. Despite the priest's failure, the villagers pressed on in their attempts to rid the valley of the sisters. Stones were thrown at the manor windows, and fires were lit near the property in the hope of driving them out. But the house stood firm, its shutters closed, its tall black windows reflecting the flames like blind eyes. At night, the villagers claimed to hear a sound rising from the manor like chanting, 7 voices speaking as one, carrying through the still air and into the hearts of those who listened. Cattle grew restless, dogs refused to go near the gates, and newborn children wailed through the night. The valley had become a place of dread, and yet no one dared cross the threshold to confront the sisters directly, for fear that whatever power kept them young might lash out and claim more lives. By the winter of that year, Hollow's End was no longer simply a village living beside a strange family, but a place living under siege from an unseen force. The sisters, now spoken of only in whispers, had taken on a mythic quality, their very existence both a threat and a terrible fascination. Those who were brave enough to approach the manor swore they could see their shapes moving past the windows, tall and slender and unchanged, and that when the wind blew just right, the 7 faces would appear for a single dreadful moment before vanishing back into the darkness within. The failed exorcisms only deepened the village's terror, for if holy men could not cleanse the Callahan house, then what manner of power must dwell there? The priests who had entered the manor never revealed what they had encountered, but their faces told the story well enough. It was said that one of them refused to sleep in the dark ever again, keeping candles burning through the night until his death. Another took to wearing a rosary around his neck, so tightly it cut into his skin, as though fearing that something unseen might claim him in his sleep. Hollow's End became divided between those who wanted to burn the manor to the ground and those who feared that doing so would unleash something far worse. The sisters themselves did nothing to defend their name, appearing only rarely and always together, standing motionless at the edge of the property like sentinels, their pale faces turned toward anyone who dared to look too long. It was around this time that villagers began to report the sound of humming coming from the attic of the manor. At first it was dismissed as wind catching in the eaves, but those who lived closest insisted that the sound had a pattern to it, a rhythm that no natural force could produce. It would begin low and soft, as though carried on the night air from very far away, and then rise until it became a clear, resonant tone, like many voices singing a single note together. The sound always came after midnight, lasting anywhere from a few minutes to nearly an hour, and then cutting off suddenly, leaving a silence so profound that it made listeners' ears ring. On more than one occasion, a traveller passing through the valley was said to have stopped in the road to listen, entranced, before vanishing without trace by morning. Soon, rumours spread that the attic was the true heart of the Callahan curse, the place where the sisters gathered to perform their rites. Farmers swore they saw light glowing behind the narrow attic windows, a pale bluish glow that no candle could produce. Some claimed to have seen the shadows of the sisters moving in unison behind the curtains, their arms raised as though in worship or invocation. This only inflamed the village further, and a group of men made plans to break into the manor one moonless night and set fire to the upper floors, believing that destroying the attic would end whatever power the sisters held. But when they returned to the village at dawn, their torches unlit and their faces ashen, they refused to speak of what they had seen, only muttering that no man could step beyond the first threshold without feeling the house breathe. Even those who stayed far from the manor could not escape the sense that something in the valley had shifted. Cows gave birth to calves with white, sightless eyes, and hens stopped laying eggs entirely for weeks at a time. At night, dogs would bark until they collapsed from exhaustion, howling at nothing visible, and then cower under beds when the humming began again. The more devout families began keeping crucifixes above every doorframe, and it was not uncommon to see villagers sprinkling salt along their thresholds in the belief it would keep whatever haunted the Callahans from crossing into their homes. Yet despite every precaution, nightmares plagued the valley, dreams of 7 pale women standing around the dreamer's bed, their faces tilted in perfect unison, their fingers reaching but never touching. The humming grew louder as the years passed, as though the sisters no longer cared to conceal it. Some claimed that on certain nights it was not only humming they heard but words, a language that no one could recognize yet, which made their skin prickle with fear. The sound was accompanied by the smell of burning herbs, bitter and cloying, that drifted through the village until every home seemed to carry the scent. When a traveling priest attempted once more to bless the land around the manor, he collapsed before completing his prayer, bleeding from the nose, and had to be carried away. This incident convinced many that the house itself was a living thing, feeding on those who dared to challenge it. By the end of the 1840s, Hollow's End had stopped trying to drive the sisters out and had instead resigned itself to coexisting with them, though the fear never lessened. No one went near the manor after sunset, and children were warned never to look toward the attic windows. The sisters remained unseen for months at a time, and when they did appear, it was almost worse, for they looked no older than they had decades before, their faces eerily identical to the day they first arrived in the valley. The humming never ceased, and by then it had become something the villagers could almost measure the passing of time by, as though their lives had been bound to the rhythm of whatever was happening inside that house. When the Callahan land was finally put up for auction in 1901, it was not because the sisters had left, but because the title to the estate had somehow passed into the hands of distant relatives who had never once set foot in Hollow's End. No one in the valley could say for certain how such a transaction had occurred, for the Callahans were still seen in the manor, their silent figures glimpsed in the windows as though nothing had changed. Nevertheless, the sale went forward, attracting wealthy buyers from London who had heard whispers of the manor's dark reputation and wished to own such a place for the novelty of it. The auction was held in the village hall, and from the moment it began, the air was thick with unease. Those in attendance claimed that a chill seemed to follow the proceedings and that every candle in the hall burned lower than it should have, casting long, quivering shadows on the walls. The bidding was fierce at first, but as the night wore on, strange occurrences began to unsettle the buyers. Several reported feeling watched, though the hall was crowded, and one man swore he heard the faint sound of women's voices humming from somewhere just outside the building. A gust of wind blew through the open windows, scattering the auction papers across the floor, and when they were gathered again, one page was missing, the deed to the manor itself. It was found hours later on the steps of the Callahan estate, weighed down with a single stone, as though it had been returned there deliberately. Despite this, the property was declared sold, though no one could agree on who had actually placed the winning bid, for the auctioneer's records were said to have been smudged with ink, the names illegible. When representatives of the buyers came to take possession of the estate, they found the gates closed but not locked. Inside, the house appeared untouched by time, every piece of furniture coated in a fine layer of dust. Yet the air smelled faintly of smoke and herbs, as though something had only just been extinguished. The sisters themselves were nowhere to be found, but there were signs that someone had been in the house recently. 7 chairs pushed back from the dining table, 7 mugs on the mantel, 7 sets of footprints in the dust leading up the staircase, but none coming down again. The men who inspected the manor did not linger long, for they said that as they moved through the house, they heard the sound of faint breathing, though there was no one else present. One swore that a door closed behind him on its own and would not open until he cried out for help. Word of these events spread quickly, and soon Hollow's End became the subject of fascination far beyond the valley. Writers and folklorists came to document the mystery, and some even stayed overnight in the village, hoping to catch sight of the legendary sisters. A few claimed success, reporting that they saw the 7 figures standing in an upstairs window, lit by moonlight, watching the road below. Others reported hearing the attic humming for the first time in decades, as though the presence of outsiders had awakened something in the house. There were even reports of people who entered the manor without permission and were never seen again, their belongings later found scattered near the edge of the property. The new owners, whoever they were, never moved into the house. Instead, the manor was left to stand empty, its windows dark, its great doors shut as though guarding something inside. The sisters were still seen from time to time, though never in daylight, always at dusk, or in the hours just before dawn, standing motionless in the windows or at the edge of the gardens. Those who witnessed them insisted that they looked exactly as they had in the old portrait painted decades earlier, unchanged and unblinking, their faces pale and serene as if carved from marble. The village began to avoid the place altogether, allowing it to fall into deeper and deeper decay until even the most daring travelers hesitated to set foot beyond the gates. As the years passed, the estate took on an air of suspended time, neither truly abandoned nor truly inhabited. The weeds grew high in the gardens, yet the paths were never completely overrun, as though someone still walked them. The house itself did not crumble as other houses did, its walls remaining straight, its windows intact, its roof unbroken despite the storms that swept through Hollow's End. On certain nights, lights could still be seen moving from room to room, pale glows that did not belong to lanterns, and villagers swore they could hear laughter drifting on the wind, not the warm laughter of living women, but something softer, more chilling, like an echo from a time long past that refused to fade. By the middle of the 20th century, the Callahan Manor had become a place of dreadful fascination, a destination for those who sought a thrill or wished to tempt fate by glimpsing the infamous 7 sisters. The sightings had become less frequent, but somehow more disturbing, for when they did appear, they seemed to be waiting, standing perfectly still in the windows as though anticipating the arrival of those who dared to look. People who lived in Hollow's End claimed that the house was never truly empty, that even when no figure could be seen, there was a presence that pressed against the glass from within, a sense that the sisters were watching from behind curtains, their breath fogging the panes, though no living warmth should have been inside. At night, travelers reported feeling a strange pull as they passed along the road, as though something from the house was calling to them, drawing their eyes upward until they could no longer look away. Those who claimed to have seen the sisters during this time described them as unnervingly identical, their hair long and black, their faces pale, their eyes reflecting the moonlight with an unnatural brightness. They did not move when spotted, did not gesture or turn away, but simply stood in place, 7 figures in 7 windows, their stillness almost worse than any sign of hostility. On rare occasions, witnesses said they saw the sisters move in unison, their heads tilting at the same moment, as if acknowledging the watcher before fading back into the darkness of the house. These sightings were so consistent that they became known as the window rituals, a name given by those who believed the sisters were deliberately showing themselves at appointed times to mark some grim observance. By this time, Hollow's End had grown more connected to the outside world, and journalists and curiosity seekers began arriving to document the phenomenon. Some came with cameras and recording equipment, hoping to capture proof of the sisters' existence, but strange mishaps plagued their efforts. Cameras jammed, film was overexposed, batteries drained in moments, and those who managed to take photographs often found them blurred or marred by streaks of light that seemed to pass through the image like ghostly hands. The few clear photographs that were produced showed the 7 women exactly as they had been described for decades, unchanged and impossibly youthful, their expressions unnervingly calm, their resemblance to one another so precise that it seemed they were no longer separate beings but copies of a single original. Those who lingered near the house for too long sometimes reported strange effects afterward. One man said that after spending a night camped outside the gates, he awoke to find his hair had turned almost completely grey, despite being only 30 years old. Another claimed that his dreams were haunted for months by visions of 7 dark-haired women standing in a ring around his bed, their faces glowing faintly as though lit from within. In one particularly chilling case, a group of travelers who had dared each other to approach the manor vanished entirely, leaving behind their car and belongings at the roadside. When searchers combed the grounds, they found no sign of a struggle, only 7 sets of wet footprints leading from the road toward the house and ending abruptly at the front door. The villagers by now no longer attempted to interfere with the manor or its occupants, believing that to do so was to invite misfortune. Children were warned from the time they could speak that they must never point at the house or speak the sisters' names after dark, for fear that doing so would draw their attention. And yet, despite the fear, there was a grim curiosity that continued to draw people toward the property. Every few years, a stranger would arrive in Hollow's End, asking about the sisters, determined to see them for themselves, and almost without fail, those strangers would leave changed, pale and tight-lipped, unwilling to speak of what they had experienced once they had stood before the gates and heard the humming that still rose from the house on certain moonless nights. Even in the later decades, when the world outside was consumed by war and turmoil, the Callahan Manor seemed untouched, its windows unbroken, its roof uncollapsed, its silent inhabitants unchanged. Locals said that the sisters had become a part of the land itself, that their continued presence had sunk into the soil, into the trees, into the very stones of the road that passed by their property. The sightings became more sporadic, but when they did occur, they seemed deliberate, as though the sisters were allowing themselves to be seen only by those they chose. There were nights when the entire house seemed lit from within by a cold, unnatural glow, and those who saw it swore that if they closed their eyes, they could still see the 7 figures standing side by side, waiting for the next soul brave enough to step beyond the rusted gates. By the early 1960s, the fascination with the Callahan sisters had shifted from quiet village rumor to a national curiosity, and Hollow's End found itself visited by thrill-seekers, amateur paranormal investigators, and those who were drawn to the manor by reasons they could not fully explain. The disappearances began slowly at first. A traveler who failed to check out of the inn, a motorcyclist whose bike was found abandoned by the roadside, a young couple whose car remained parked near the gates for 3 days before it was finally towed away. The police investigations never produced answers, for there were no signs of violence, no tracks leading away, no evidence of forced entry at the manor. It was as though the people had simply walked toward the house and then ceased to exist. Each time it happened, the air in the valley seemed to grow heavier, and the villagers whispered that the sisters were claiming those who had come too close. The disappearances only seemed to encourage more daring trespassers, for some saw the manor as a challenge, a place where the bravest could prove themselves by venturing inside. Groups of young men would gather near the gates at night, drinking and shouting to rouse the sisters, daring one another to cross onto the property. Some returned laughing and boastful, claiming they had heard footsteps on the upper floors or caught a glimpse of a figure in the shadows. But there were others who did not return, and their companions spoke of feeling a sudden, crushing fear that drove them back to the road, as though unseen hands were pushing them away. The police grew weary of being called to search the manor grounds, for each time they found nothing but silence. The air inside the house stale and still, the dust on the floors undisturbed save for the faint marks of what might have been 7 sets of bare feet. In one of the most infamous incidents, a journalist from London came to Hollow's End in the summer of 1972 with the intention of writing a full exposé on the Callahan mystery. He brought with him a photographer and a tape recorder, and the two men spent an entire night outside the manor gates. In the morning, the photographer was found sitting by the road, staring blankly, unable to speak, while the journalist was never seen again. When the tape recorder was recovered, it contained hours of faint static punctuated by what sounded like distant voices singing in harmony. The last minutes of the tape were said to contain a single, piercing note that caused the listener's ears to ring long after the machine had been switched off, and some who heard it swore that in the background they could make out the sound of footsteps coming closer. The villagers became increasingly fearful as the disappearances mounted, and some began to move away from Hollow's End altogether, abandoning homes that had been in their families for generations. Those who stayed kept their windows barred and their doors locked, and few dared to leave their homes after dark. It was during this time that the sightings became more frequent again, the sisters appearing not just in the windows of the manor, but along the road itself, standing in a line by the gates, their faces expressionless, their eyes fixed on those who passed. Witnesses claimed that they never saw them arrive or leave, that one moment the road was empty, and the next, the 7 women were there, as though they had stepped out of the darkness itself. The final wave of vanishings came in 1974, when a group of local teenagers, emboldened by years of hearing the stories, decided to break into the manor on a stormy June night. 7 of them went up the path toward the house, but only one returned, stumbling into the village in the early hours of the morning, drenched, shaking, and incoherent. Her hair, once dark, had turned completely white, and she was unable to speak for 3 full days. When she finally found her voice, she muttered a single phrase over and over, insisting that the sisters had been waiting, that they had been standing in the great hall as though expecting them. Before she could say more, her condition worsened, and she died in the hospital that same week, her bedsheets torn where she had scrawled words into the fabric with her fingernails. After that night, the manor seemed to grow still in a way it never had before. The humming ceased, the lights were no longer seen in the windows, and for the first time in living memory, there were no more sightings of the sisters. Some took this as a sign that they had finally claimed what they had been waiting for and had departed, while others believed they were still there, silent now, watching from the darkened rooms for whoever would be foolish enough to disturb them next. The house remained standing, its gates rusted shut, its gardens overgrown, but those who pass by say they still feel the weight of unseen eyes upon them, and that on certain nights, if the wind is just right, a faint note can still be heard drifting from the attic, too soft to be mistaken for anything else. In the years following the silence of the manor, Hollow's End entered a strange period of uneasy calm. The absence of sightings should have brought relief, but instead it deepened the sense of dread, as though the village was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the stillness. The house stood untouched, its windows dark, its iron gates sealed shut by vines and rust, but no one dared approach to see if the doors would still open. The old path leading up to the manor became overgrown, swallowed by weeds, and locals whispered that it was best to let the earth take it back. At night, some claimed they could still see movement in the upper windows if they stared too long, a flicker of white like a face vanishing just out of view. Others heard music drifting through the trees on still nights, a faint and distant harmony that faded when they turned their heads. By the 1980s, the legend of the Callahan sisters had grown beyond the borders of the village, becoming the subject of books, radio programs, and eventually documentaries that attempted to piece together a rational explanation for the events. Skeptics called the story mass hysteria, a case of superstition passed down through generations, but those who had lived through the disappearances refused to speak to cameras or answer questions, their silence adding to the sense of something deeply real and deeply wrong. Researchers who attempted to investigate the manor often encountered strange misfortunes. Cars would break down on the road leading to the property, recording equipment would fail, and one historian who entered the manor claimed to have lost several hours of time, awakening outside the gates with no memory of how she had left the building. Her watch had stopped at exactly midnight, and for the rest of her life, she refused to set foot in Hollow's End again. Those who visited the village during this era often remarked on the strange feeling that lingered near the manor. Some described it as a pressure, a heaviness in the air that grew stronger the closer one came to the gates, as though the entire property existed under some invisible weight. Animals avoided the area entirely, dogs refusing to walk the road past the house, birds falling silent when they flew overhead. The trees on the manor grounds grew twisted, their branches bent in strange, unnatural shapes that seemed to curl away from the house rather than toward it. There were reports that on certain nights the moonlight did not seem to touch the manor at all, leaving it in a pool of blackness even when the rest of the valley was bathed in silver light. In 1989, a group of paranormal researchers arrived with advanced equipment, determined to record the interior of the manor once and for all. They managed to break through the corroded gates and set up cameras in several rooms, but when they reviewed the footage, they found nothing but static, as though the house had swallowed all images and sounds. The team returned a second night and attempted a live broadcast, but the signal cut out at precisely the same time as the historians stopped watch years earlier, just as the clock in the hall struck 12. When the signal returned, the cameras were lying on the floor as though knocked from their tripods, and the team refused to speak publicly about what had happened. Rumor spread that they had heard singing inside the walls, 7 voices weaving in and out of harmony until the sound became unbearable. As the century turned, the manor became a place of pilgrimage for those obsessed with the supernatural, and more than once the police were called to escort trespassers from the property. Some left quietly, shaken but unharmed, while others left small offerings at the gates, flowers, jewelry, and even photographs of lost relatives, as though hoping the sisters might return them in exchange for whatever price had been paid so long ago. It was during this time that a strange pattern began to emerge, as several of those who had left offerings reported unusual occurrences in their lives afterward. Some claimed miraculous recoveries from illness. Others said they had begun dreaming vividly of 7 women who would whisper secrets about the future, secrets that would later come true. Yet there were darker stories too, of people who were followed by misfortune until they fled the country entirely, unable to escape the feeling that someone was watching them even in their sleep. Despite the growing mythos, the house itself remained standing, untouched by fire, storms, or decay, in a way that seemed almost unnatural. Roof tiles that should have fallen held fast, windows that should have shattered remained intact, and the iron gates, though covered in rust, never buckled under their own weight. Those who dared to cross the grounds and peer through the windows claimed that the interior was frozen in time, the furniture covered in dust but still arranged as if awaiting guests. On the dining table, 7 chairs were always neatly in place, their high backs lined up perfectly, their seats empty but faintly marked with the outline of where someone had once sat. The air inside was said to smell faintly of something sweet, like old flowers left to dry, a scent that clung to the clothes of those who entered long after they had left.